Tonight, we'll travel back to the dusty plains of the Holy Land, to a November day in 1177, when the fate of Jerusalem hung by a thread, and a small force of warriors in white mantles marked with red crosses stood between destruction and salvation. This is the story of the Battle of Montgisard, where 300 Templar knights, alongside a young king and his outnumbered army, would face one of the greatest military minds of the age in a confrontation that would alter the course of the Crusades. Settle in, dim your lights, and let your mind wander back through the centuries as we explore this remarkable chapter in medieval history. The year is 1177. The Christian kingdom of Jerusalem, established nearly 80 years prior during the First Crusade, finds itself in a precarious position. To understand the significance of what would unfold at Montgisard, we must first understand the fragile political landscape of the Levant in this period. The Kingdom of Jerusalem stands as the easternmost outpost of Christendom, a Latin Christian state surrounded by Muslim territories. Its very existence is a constant source of tension, viewed by its neighbors as an intrusion, while Christians see it as the fulfillment of a divine mission to reclaim the holy sites where Jesus Christ once walked. By 1177, the initial fervor of the First Crusade has long faded. The kingdom exists in a state of uneasy coexistence with its neighbors, punctuated by periods of open warfare. Alliances shift like the desert sands, with Christian and Muslim powers sometimes finding themselves as unlikely allies against common enemies. The kingdom itself is weakened from within. King Amalric I had died 3 years earlier in 1174, leaving the throne to his 13-year-old son, Baldwin IV. Young Baldwin might have grown to become a strong ruler under normal circumstances, but fate had dealt him a cruel hand. The young king suffered from leprosy, a disease that slowly consumed his body even as he struggled to hold his kingdom together. Despite his illness, Baldwin IV demonstrated remarkable courage and determination. Known to history as the Leper King, he refused to allow his affliction to prevent him from ruling. Yet the reality of his condition meant that many within the kingdom were already looking to what would come after him, jockeying for position and influence. Into this atmosphere of uncertainty stepped one of the most formidable figures of the age, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the Western world as Saladin. Saladin was no ordinary leader. Born to a Kurdish family in Tikrit, in modern-day Iraq, he had risen through the ranks to become vizier of Egypt before establishing the Ayyubid dynasty that would unite Egypt and Syria under his rule. By 1177, he had consolidated his power and turned his attention to what he considered the ultimate prize, Jerusalem. Intelligent, disciplined, and charismatic, Saladin was as skilled in diplomacy as he was in warfare. Unlike many of his predecessors, he understood that brute force alone would not achieve his aims. He cultivated a reputation for mercy and justice, even among his enemies, while simultaneously building one of the most effective fighting forces in the region. Saladin's rise to power had been swift and impressive. After the death of his uncle Shirkuh in 1169, he had taken control in Egypt, gradually asserting his independence from his nominal overlord, Nur ad-Din, the ruler of Syria. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, the same year as King Amalric, Saladin moved quickly to extend his control over Syria as well. By 1177, Saladin had achieved what few thought possible: the unification of Egypt and much of Syria under a single ruler. This new Muslim superpower now encircled the Crusader states on multiple fronts, creating an existential threat to the Christian presence in the Holy Land. For Saladin, the conquest of Jerusalem was both a political necessity and a religious duty. As long as the Holy City remained in Christian hands, his position as the defender of Islam would be incomplete. He had attempted a major assault in 1171, only to be forced to retreat. Now, 6 years later, he was ready to try again with greater resources at his command. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the immediate fate of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and potentially the future of the entire Crusader enterprise in the East. Before we advance our story further, we must understand one of its central players, the Knights Templar, and particularly the 300 knights who would play such a crucial role at Montgisard. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, as they were officially known, had been founded in the aftermath of the First Crusade. Their original purpose was humble: to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the holy sites. Founded around 1119 by Hudipayans and 8 other knights, they took monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, while dedicating themselves to armed protection of the faithful, a revolutionary concept at the time. By 1177, however, the Templars had evolved into something far more significant. They had become one of the most elite fighting forces in the medieval world, with chapters throughout Europe and the Holy Land. They were easily recognized by their distinctive white mantles bearing the Red Cross, symbolizing their willingness to shed blood in defense of the faith. What made the Templars unique was their dual nature. They were both monks and warriors, bound by religious vows yet trained in the arts of war. They lived austere lives governed by a strict rule, forbidden from retreating in battle unless outnumbered 3-1, and even then only with permission. Their reputation for ferocity and discipline made them feared throughout the Muslim world. The Templars were more than just fighters, however. Through donations and careful management, they had built a financial network that spanned Europe and the Near East. They could transfer money across vast distances, lend to kings, and finance major operations. This combination of military might and financial power made them indispensable to the Crusader kingdoms. In Jerusalem, the Templars maintained their headquarters on the Temple Mount, in what they believed to be the remains of Solomon's Temple, actually the Al-Aqsa Mosque. From this symbolic location, they coordinated a network of castles and commanderies throughout the Holy Land, serving as a critical component of the kingdom's defensive strategy. The 300 Templar knights who would ride to Montgisard represented a significant portion of the order's fighting strength in the region. These were not ordinary soldiers but highly trained warrior monks, each supported by sergeants and squires, equipped with the finest weapons and armor available, and mounted on war horses bred for strength and endurance. In an age when a single knight could represent a significant military investment, the commitment of 300 Templars to a single battle was extraordinary. Their Grand Master at this time was Odo de Saint-Amand, a proud and unyielding leader who had clashed with King Baldwin on numerous occasions. Despite these tensions, when word reached him of Saladin's invasion, he did not hesitate. The defense of the kingdom transcended personal quarrels, and the Templars would honor their sacred duty. As summer gave way to autumn in 1177, intelligence began to reach Jerusalem of Saladin's preparations for a major campaign. Spies, merchants, and travelers all brought the same worrying news. The Ayyubid ruler was assembling a massive force in Egypt, clearly intended for something more than a mere border raid. King Baldwin IV, despite being only 16 years old and increasingly debilitated by his disease, recognized the gravity of the threat. He called upon his vassals and the military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, to prepare for war. Yet his position was perilous. Many of his most experienced knights and nobles were absent from the kingdom. Count Philip of Flanders had arrived on pilgrimage with a substantial force, and Baldwin had hoped to use this reinforcement for an expedition against Saladin's territories. However, the Count refused to serve under the king and departed northward to Tripoli, taking with him not only his own men but also many of the kingdom's barons who hoped for conquests in the north. This left Baldwin with a significantly reduced fighting force just as intelligence confirmed his worst fears. Saladin had crossed the Sinai with an army estimated at 26,000 men, including his elite Mamluk cavalry. The news grew worse. Rather than attacking the border fortresses as expected, Saladin had bypassed the kingdom's southern defenses entirely. His army had swept past the fortress of Gaza and was now moving rapidly inland, toward the heart of the kingdom. The Muslim leader had gambled that with Baldwin's forces depleted, a bold strike might capture Jerusalem itself before the Christians could organize an effective resistance. Baldwin, residing in Ascalon when news of the invasion arrived, found himself in an impossible position. With him were only his personal guard and a small number of knights. The bulk of his reduced army was scattered throughout the kingdom, including the vital Templar contingent. Despite counselors urging him to remain safely behind Ascalon's walls, the young king made a fateful decision. He would not hide while his kingdom was invaded. Taking with him the few hundred knights at his disposal, Baldwin set out to shadow Saladin's army while urgent messages were dispatched to rally what forces could be gathered. Among those messages was a call to the Templars in Jerusalem. Their response would be swift and decisive. 300 knights, led by their marshal, would ride immediately to join their king. It would be a race against time, with the fate of the kingdom hanging in the balance. Meanwhile, Saladin's massive army continued its advance, pausing briefly to raid and destroy the town of Ramla before moving on toward Jerusalem. The Muslim commander was confident in his strategy. By the time the Christians could assemble a force large enough to challenge him, he expected to be in possession of their holy city. What Saladin could not have anticipated was the determination of a 16-year-old leper king and the discipline of 300 warrior monks who had sworn to defend the Holy Land to their last breath. As Saladin's army continued its advance through Christian territory, leaving destruction in its wake, King Baldwin IV was engaged in a desperate gambit. With only a few hundred knights at his command, he shadowed the much larger Muslim force, always maintaining enough distance to avoid detection while looking for an opportunity to strike. It was a dangerous game. If Saladin became aware of the small Christian force tracking his movements, he could easily turn and annihilate them. Baldwin was counting on the element of surprise and the arrival of reinforcements before he would be forced to engage. The terrain they traversed was the coastal plain of what is now central Israel, a landscape of rolling hills and small valleys that gradually rise toward the Judean mountains in the east. November brought cooler temperatures, but the land remained dry, creating clouds of dust that rose from beneath the hooves of thousands of horses and the feet of Saladin's infantry. These dust clouds proved to be both a blessing and a curse for Baldwin. While they obscured his small force from Saladin's scouts, they also made it impossible to lose track of the massive Ayyubid army. Day after day, the young king followed this dusty beacon, waiting for the right moment. Meanwhile, the 300 Templars had departed Jerusalem with all haste. Led by their marshal, they rode west toward Ascalon, expecting to rendezvous with the king there. When word reached them that Baldwin was shadowing Saladin's army, they adjusted their course, pushing their war horses to the limit in their determination to reach the king before he was forced into battle. The Templar contingent was an impressive sight. Each knight wore a mail hauberk beneath his white surcoat marked with the Red Cross, a conical helmet with a nasal guard, and carried a kite-shaped shield. They were armed with lances for the initial charge, swords for close combat, and many also carried maces or war hammers for dealing with heavily armored opponents. Their war horses were massive beasts, bred for strength rather than speed, capable of carrying an armored knight and maintaining a devastating charge. Accompanying the knights were their sergeants and support personnel, squires to assist with armor and equipment, servants to manage the camp, and light cavalry scouts. The Templars traveled with minimal baggage, prepared to engage in combat at a moment's notice. As they rode, the Templars would have engaged in prayer, for they were not merely soldiers but religious men who saw their military service as an extension of their monastic vows. The rhythmic prayers, recited in Latin as they rode, steeled their resolve and reminded them of the sacred nature of their mission. Their journey took them through terrain that was increasingly dangerous. With Saladin's main army nearby and scouts and raiding parties potentially anywhere, the Templars maintained strict discipline. They traveled in formation, ready to form battle lines at the first sign of enemy contact. After several days of hard riding, scouts brought word that King Baldwin's force had been located. The Templars adjusted their course once more, driving their tired mounts forward with renewed purpose. They were not the only reinforcements making their way to the king. Elements of the royal army that had been stationed elsewhere in the kingdom were also converging on his position, drawn by the messengers Baldwin had dispatched upon first learning of Saladin's invasion. By November 25, 1177, the Templars had successfully linked up with Baldwin's small force near the settlement of Montgisard, also called Montgisard, close to the town of Ramla that Saladin had already destroyed. Their arrival, along with other reinforcements that had managed to reach the king, brought Baldwin's army to approximately 450 knights and perhaps a few thousand infantry, still vastly outnumbered by Saladin's force of 26,000, but now at least a fighting force to be reckoned with. The question facing Baldwin and his commanders was whether to risk everything on an attack or to continue shadowing Saladin's army in the hope that more reinforcements would arrive. It was a momentous decision, one that would determine not just the outcome of the current campaign, but potentially the future of the Christian presence in the Holy Land. As dawn broke on November 25, 1177, King Baldwin IV convened a council of war with his most trusted advisors and the leaders of the military forces that had joined him, including the Templar Marshal. The situation they faced was grim by any conventional military assessment. Saladin's army of 26,000 was still largely intact. It included his elite Mamluk heavy cavalry, light Bedouin horsemen, and thousands of infantry armed with bows, spears, and swords. This was a force that had already swept aside what little resistance it had encountered and was now pressing toward Jerusalem with apparent impunity. Against this host, Baldwin had assembled perhaps 500 knights and several thousand infantry, outnumbered by at least 5 to 1. Conventional wisdom dictated caution. Continue to shadow Saladin's army, harass its flanks, and wait for more reinforcements. But several factors prompted Baldwin to consider a bolder approach. Intelligence reports indicated that Saladin, confident in his overwhelming numerical advantage, had become careless. His army had spread out over several miles as units advanced at different speeds. More significantly, many of his troops had broken formation to raid and plunder the surrounding countryside, drawn by the prospect of rich booty in Christian lands. This presented an opportunity, but one that required immediate action before Saladin could reorganize his scattered forces. Baldwin, despite his youth and illness, recognized the moment for what it was: a chance to strike at the heart of the Muslim army while it was temporarily vulnerable. Not everyone agreed with this assessment. Some of his advisors counseled patience, arguing that an attack against such overwhelming numbers was tantamount to suicide. Better, they suggested, to continue the waiting game or to fall back to one of the kingdom's fortified cities and withstand a siege until further help could arrive from Europe. It was at this critical juncture that the Templars made their influence felt. According to contemporary chronicles, the Templar Marshal spoke forcefully in favor of attack. The warrior monks were trained never to refuse combat against the enemies of Christendom, regardless of the odds. Their presence, he argued, was a sign from God that the time to strike had come. The Marshal reminded the king of biblical precedent, how Gideon with just 300 chosen men had defeated the vast Midianite army, and how young David had triumphed over the seemingly invincible Goliath. Was not their cause equally righteous? Was not their faith equally strong? Baldwin IV, despite his physical frailty, possessed a courage that impressed even hardened warriors. The young king had never allowed his illness to become an excuse for inaction, and he would not start now when his kingdom faced its greatest peril. After hearing all arguments, he made his decision. They would attack. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than engaging Saladin's entire army, they would strike directly at its center, where the Sultan himself would be located with his bodyguard and command elements. If they could create enough confusion and possibly kill or capture Saladin, the rest of the Muslim army might disintegrate. The attack would be spearheaded by the heavy cavalry, the Knights of the Kingdom and the Templars, whose armored charge could punch through the enemy lines. The infantry would follow to exploit any breakthrough and protect the knights from being surrounded. As preparations for battle began, Baldwin took one further step that demonstrated both his personal courage and his understanding of the symbolic importance of leadership. Despite his condition, he insisted on leading the charge personally. Barely able to hold a sword due to the nerve damage caused by leprosy, he had himself strapped to his horse so that he would not fall during the combat. The sight of their young, afflicted king willing to risk everything alongside them had a galvanizing effect on the Christian troops. If this boy, suffering from a debilitating disease that would eventually claim his life, could face death with such courage, how could they do any less? As the Christian army formed up for battle, priests moved among the ranks, hearing hasty confessions and offering blessings. The knights checked their equipment one last time, tightening saddle girths, securing helmet straps, and ensuring their weapons were ready. The Templars, as was their custom before battle, recited the psalm, "Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but unto thy name give glory." Then, with banners unfurled and lances couched, they awaited the king's command to advance against an enemy that outnumbered them many times over. It was not just a battle they were about to join, but a moment that would echo through the centuries. The November sun had risen higher in the sky as Baldwin's army approached the unsuspecting forces of Saladin near Montgisard. The element of surprise was critical to their strategy. If Saladin had time to rally his scattered forces and form proper battle lines, the Christian army would face almost certain annihilation. Fortune favored the bold that day. Saladin's army, spread out and many engaged in plundering, had not expected a frontal assault from an enemy they believed to be hiding behind distant walls. The first indication many had of the Christian attack was the sight of hundreds of armored knights emerging from behind a ridge, sunlight glinting off their armor and weapons, banners and pennons snapping in the breeze. At the forefront rode the impossible figure of King Baldwin IV, the leper king, strapped to his horse but erect in his saddle, his royal banner held high beside him. Flanking him were the Templars, their distinctive white mantles with red crosses making them instantly recognizable to friend and foe alike. The initial Muslim response was confusion rather than organized resistance. Scattered groups of Saladin's forces scrambled to form defensive positions, but they had neither the time nor the cohesion to establish an effective line. As the Christian knights closed the distance, they lowered their lances and spurred their horses to a gallop. The earth seemed to tremble beneath the hooves of hundreds of war horses as the Christian heavy cavalry thundered toward the disorganized Muslim ranks. In the critical moments before impact, the psychological effect was as important as the physical. Many of Saladin's troops, particularly the less disciplined contingents, broke and fled rather than face the terrifying spectacle of armored knights in full charge. For those who stood their ground, the result was devastating. The concentrated weight of the Christian charge, led by the Templars and the king's household knights, smashed through the hastily formed Muslim defensive positions like a hammer through glass. Lances found their marks in the first seconds of contact, unhorsing or impaling the front ranks of Saladin's defenders. As lances shattered from the impact, the knights drew swords, maces, and war hammers, continuing the assault in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The discipline instilled by years of training was evident as the Templars maintained their formation even in the chaos of battle, protecting each other's flanks and preventing the more numerous enemy from surrounding them. Baldwin, despite his physical limitations, fought with a ferocity that inspired those around him. Contemporary chronicles describe him as striking down several opponents personally, though these accounts may contain elements of hagiography intended to enhance the miraculous nature of the victory. Saladin, to his credit, responded quickly to the unexpected assault. A veteran of many campaigns, he recognized the danger immediately and attempted to rally his personal guard and nearby units to form a defensive core around which the rest of his army could regroup. Messages were dispatched to recall the scattered raiding parties, while his officers struggled to organize a coherent response to the Christian onslaught. For a brief period, the battle hung in the balance. The initial Christian charge had created confusion and panic, but Saladin's forces still enjoyed overwhelming numerical superiority. If they could absorb the shock of the first assault and bring their numbers to bear, they might yet encircle and destroy Baldwin's smaller army. It was at this critical juncture that the 300 Templars demonstrated why they were considered the elite fighting force of the Christian world. Having penetrated deep into the Muslim formation, they focused their attack directly on Saladin's position, recognizing that the defeat or capture of the Sultan would likely end the battle regardless of the overall numbers. The Templar battle cry of "Busant," the name of their black and white battle standard, echoed across the battlefield as they fought with the disciplined ferocity that had made them legendary. Unlike secular knights, who might be tempted by the prospect of valuable ransoms or plunder, the Templars had a single-minded purpose: victory or martyrdom. This concentrated assault on the Muslim center created a crisis that required Saladin's immediate attention. The Sultan found himself fighting not for victory, but for survival, as the battle swirled around him with increasing intensity. As the battle raged on, what had begun as a desperate gambit by an outnumbered Christian force began to transform into something altogether different. The initial shock and confusion caused by Baldwin's surprise attack had prevented Saladin from effectively deploying his numerical advantage. But more than this, it had created a psychological turning point. Throughout the Muslim ranks, word spread rapidly that the Christians had launched a massive counterattack. As often happens in the fog of war, the size and strength of the attacking force grew with each retelling, until many believed they faced the entire military might of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, perhaps augmented by fresh arrivals from Europe. For the many raiding parties scattered across the countryside, the distant sounds of battle and the sight of dust clouds rising above Montgisard presented a dilemma. Should they abandon their plundering and return to the main army, potentially riding into an ambush or a defeat in progress, or should they save themselves while they could? Many chose the latter option. Small groups of Saladin's forces, particularly the Bedouin auxiliaries and lighter troops who had spread out in search of plunder, began to melt away from the battlefield. Rather than reinforcing their comrades, they retreated toward the safety of Egyptian territory, taking their looted goods with them. Meanwhile, at the heart of the battle, Saladin found himself in increasingly desperate circumstances. The Templars, with their characteristic disregard for personal safety, had driven deep into his defensive perimeter, targeting his elite Mamluk bodyguard. Several of his most trusted emirs had already fallen, and the protective circle around him was shrinking by the minute. The Sultan, known for his calm demeanor even in crisis, recognized that the battle was lost. If he remained, he risked death or capture, either of which would likely mean the collapse of the empire he had worked so hard to build. The strategic decision was clear, if bitter to accept. He must withdraw to fight another day. Gathering what remained of his personal guard, Saladin fought his way out of the encirclement that was closing around him. According to some accounts, he was forced to flee on a racing camel rather than his war horse, abandoning his royal insignia and personal belongings in the process. The sight of Saladin's retreat, even with a small contingent of his guard, had an immediate and catastrophic effect on Muslim morale. Units that had been fighting effectively began to disintegrate as individual soldiers made their own decisions to flee while escape was still possible. What had been a battle transformed rapidly into a rout. The disciplined Christian forces, sensing victory, pressed their advantage relentlessly. The Templars, in particular, showed no mercy, cutting down fleeing enemy troops without hesitation or restraint. King Baldwin, still strapped to his horse but now clearly victorious, directed the pursuit with tactical acumen that belied his youth. Rather than allowing his forces to scatter in undisciplined pursuit, he maintained core units in formation, ensuring that any attempt by portions of Saladin's army to regroup and counterattack would be met with organized resistance. The Christian infantry, coming up behind the cavalry, secured the battlefield and dealt with wounded or surrounded enemy soldiers. They also began the practical work that follows any medieval battle, gathering weapons, armor, and valuable equipment from the fallen, securing prisoners who might be worth a ransom, and tending to their own wounded. By late afternoon, what had seemed impossible in the morning had become reality. Saladin's mighty invasion force, which had threatened the very existence of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, had been shattered. The Sultan himself was in flight toward the safety of Egypt, accompanied by only a fraction of the army he had led so confidently into Christian territory. On the blood-soaked field of Montgisard, King Baldwin IV had achieved what would be remembered as his greatest victory, and the Templars had written another chapter in their legend. But the full consequences of this remarkable battle were yet to unfold. As the sun set on November 25, 1177, the scale of the Christian victory became clear. Saladin's once mighty army lay in ruins. Contemporary chronicles, which may exaggerate for dramatic effect, claim that only 1/10 of his force survived to return to Egypt, perhaps 2,600 men out of the original 26,000. While modern historians might question these precise numbers, there is no doubt that Saladin suffered a devastating defeat. The battlefield itself presented a grim spectacle. Thousands of bodies lay scattered across the plains near Montgisard, along with abandoned weapons, shields, and standards. The Christians had captured Saladin's camp with all its treasures, tents, supplies, war chests, and even the Sultan's personal belongings. Among these was reportedly Saladin's personal copy of the Quran, a symbolic prize that demonstrated how narrowly he had escaped capture or death. For King Baldwin IV, the victory was more than military. It was miraculous. Despite his illness and the overwhelming odds, he had preserved his kingdom when its destruction seemed inevitable. Contemporary Christian chroniclers were quick to attribute the outcome to divine intervention, comparing it to the biblical victories of Gideon or David against seemingly insurmountable foes. The Templars emerged from the battle with their reputation further enhanced. Their discipline and courage had been critical in targeting Saladin's command center and forcing his retreat. The 300 knights who had ridden from Jerusalem had suffered losses, but their sacrifice had helped secure a victory that would be celebrated throughout Christendom. In the immediate aftermath, Baldwin displayed both tactical wisdom and mercy. While his forces pursued the fleeing remnants of Saladin's army all the way to the borders of Egypt, ensuring they could not regroup for a counterattack, he also ordered that wounded Muslim soldiers found on the battlefield be treated according to the medical knowledge of the time. This was not merely humanitarian but practical. Some could be ransomed, and such treatment enhanced his reputation even among his enemies. The battle had significant strategic implications. Saladin's defeat provided the Kingdom of Jerusalem with a much-needed reprieve. The Sultan would not attempt another major invasion for several years, giving the Christians time to strengthen their defenses and consolidate their position. For Saladin personally, Montgisard represented the most serious setback of his career thus far. His carefully cultivated image as an invincible champion of Islam had been tarnished. Upon his return to Cairo, he reportedly went into seclusion for days, seeing almost no one while he grappled with the magnitude of his defeat. Yet Saladin's true greatness as a leader would be demonstrated in how he responded to this setback. Rather than being broken by failure, he used it as an opportunity for reflection and reorganization. He analyzed what had gone wrong at Montgisard: the overconfidence, the lack of discipline among his troops, the vulnerability of his extended supply lines, and resolved to address these weaknesses. In the Christian kingdoms of Europe, news of the victory spread rapidly, taking on increasingly mythical dimensions with each retelling. The image of the young leper king, strapped to his horse yet leading his knights to victory against overwhelming odds, captured the imagination of the medieval world. Donations and recruits flowed to the military orders, particularly the Templars, whose role in the battle was celebrated in songs and stories. For the common people of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the victory brought immediate relief and renewed hope. Villages that had been abandoned in the face of the invasion were reoccupied. Fields were replanted, and damaged infrastructure repaired. Churches throughout the kingdom held services of thanksgiving, attributing their deliverance to divine favor rather than military skill or luck. Yet beneath the celebration lay a sobering reality that the more perceptive observers recognized. The kingdom had survived by the narrowest of margins. Had Saladin been more cautious, had Baldwin been less bold, had the Templars arrived a day later, the outcome might have been entirely different. The structural weaknesses of the Crusader states, their limited manpower, their dependence on military orders and occasional reinforcements from Europe, their precarious position surrounded by hostile territories, remained unchanged. Baldwin IV, despite his triumph, was still a king with a terminal illness. His leprosy continued its inexorable progression, and the question of succession loomed larger with each passing year. The victory at Montgisard had earned the kingdom a respite, not a permanent solution to its fundamental challenges. The Battle of Montgisard, while celebrated in its time, has often been overshadowed in popular historical consciousness by later events such as the Battle of Hattin and Saladin's eventual capture of Jerusalem. Yet its significance in the history of the Crusades can hardly be overstated. First and foremost, the battle represented a crucial turning point in the timeline of the Crusader states. Had Saladin's invasion succeeded in 1177, the history of the region would likely have been dramatically altered. Jerusalem might have fallen a decade earlier than it ultimately did, and the Third Crusade, with its famous confrontation between Saladin and Richard the Lionheart, might never have occurred in the form we know. The victory extended the life of the Kingdom of Jerusalem during a particularly vulnerable period. With Baldwin IV's illness progressing and questions about succession creating internal tensions, the kingdom needed time to stabilize. Montgisard provided that time, allowing for several more years of relative security before Saladin would again pose an existential threat. For the Templars, Montgisard became a defining moment in their organizational mythology. The story of the 300 knights who rode to join their king and helped achieve an against-all-odds victory enhanced their reputation throughout Christendom. This translated into tangible benefits. increased donations, new recruits, and greater political influence in both the Holy Land and Europe. In military history, Montgisard offers several valuable lessons that transcend its medieval context. It demonstrates the importance of leadership, with Baldwin's personal courage providing a critical morale boost to his outnumbered forces. It illustrates how discipline and focused tactics, exemplified by the Templars, can overcome numerical superiority. Perhaps most significantly, it shows how overconfidence and poor troop discipline can undermine even the strongest army, as happened to Saladin's forces. The battle also had theological significance for medieval Christians. In an age when military outcomes were commonly interpreted through a religious lens, Montgisard seemed to provide clear evidence of divine favor. That a teenage king afflicted with leprosy could defeat one of the most powerful Muslim leaders appeared nothing short of miraculous. Churches throughout Europe celebrated the victory with special services, and it was cited by preachers as evidence that God still supported the Crusader cause. For Saladin, the defeat at Montgisard provided valuable lessons that he would apply in future campaigns. He became more cautious in his strategic planning, more attentive to maintaining discipline among his troops, and more careful about extending his supply lines. When he eventually achieved his greatest victory at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, these lessons were evident in his methodical approach and tight control over his forces. In the broader context of Christian-Muslim relations, Montgisard represented another chapter in the complex interaction between these civilizations. While the battle itself was characterized by brutal combat, the aftermath showed elements of the chivalry and mutual respect that sometimes transcended religious divisions in the medieval Levant. Baldwin's treatment of wounded Muslim soldiers and Saladin's dignified response to defeat reflected a recognition of shared human values, even amid religious conflict. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of Montgisard's legacy relates to King Baldwin for himself. The battle stands as the defining achievement of a young man who refused to allow physical affliction to determine his fate. Though he would rule for only a few more years, dying at the age of 24 in 1185, his victory at Montgisard ensured that he would be remembered not merely as the leper king, but as a leader of exceptional courage and determination. In modern times, the Battle of Montgisard has experienced something of a revival in popular interest, featured in historical novels, documentary series, and even strategy games. This renewed attention has helped bring this pivotal engagement out from the shadow of more widely known Crusader battles like Hattin or Arsuf. Modern historians have been particularly interested in separating the mythological elements that have accrued around the battle from its historical reality. Archaeological work in the region has helped establish a more precise understanding of where exactly the battle took place and the types of weapons and armor that would have been employed. Finds of arrowheads, broken pieces of mail, and other battlefield debris have provided tangible connections to this moment in history, though much of the battlefield has been disturbed by centuries of agriculture and development. Military analysts continue to study Montgisard as a classic example of how a smaller, more disciplined force can defeat a larger but more dispersed enemy. The battle is sometimes taught in military academies alongside other historical examples like Cannae or Agincourt as a demonstration of the importance of concentration of force, surprise, and targeting the enemy's center of gravity. For the Templar order, Montgisard would remain a bright spot in their increasingly troubled history. In the century that followed, the Templars would face the loss of the Holy Land, accusations of heresy and corruption, and ultimately their brutal suppression in 1307 under King Philip IV of France. Yet the memory of their courage at Montgisard remained uncorrupted, a testament to the original ideals of an organization that had begun with the humble mission of protecting pilgrims. While Montgisard had provided the Kingdom of Jerusalem with a critical reprieve, it would prove to be temporary. Saladin, having learned from his defeat, returned to his domains to rebuild his forces and reconsider his strategy. The Sultan's response to failure revealed much about his character. Rather than seeking scapegoats or denying the magnitude of his defeat, he accepted responsibility and focused on ensuring he would not make the same mistakes again. Over the following years, Saladin consolidated his position, dealing with internal challenges to his authority and strengthening the unity of his territories. He maintained pressure on the Crusader states through smaller raids and diplomatic maneuvering, but avoided another major invasion until he was confident in his preparations. The opportunity Saladin had been waiting for came in 1187, 10 years after Montgisard. By this time, King Baldwin IV had succumbed to his illness, and the kingdom was ruled by Guy of Lusignan, a less capable leader who had gained the throne through his marriage to Baldwin's sister Sibylla. Internal divisions had weakened the kingdom, and the discipline that had saved it at Montgisard was notably absent. At the Battle of Hattin on July 4, 1187, Saladin achieved his revenge. Demonstrating that he had learned the lessons of Montgisard well, he lured the Christian army into a trap, cutting them off from water sources and forcing them to fight under extremely unfavorable conditions. The result was the near-total destruction of the military strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, including most of the Templars and Hospitallers who had fought there. With the Christian field army destroyed, Jerusalem itself fell to Saladin in October 1187. The holy city that Baldwin IV and the Templars had saved at Montgisard was lost, prompting the call for the Third Crusade that would bring Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa to the Holy Land. In this way, the wheel of history turned full circle. The victory at Montgisard had extended the life of the Kingdom of Jerusalem by a decade, but could not change the fundamental strategic realities that made its position so precarious. Yet that decade was significant. It represented an entire generation in medieval terms, 10 years in which pilgrims could visit the holy sites, in which Christian communities could live under their own rule, in which the great experiment of the Crusader states could continue. For the Knights Templar, the Battle of Montgisard represented both their finest hour and a bittersweet reminder of what might have been. The 300 knights who rode to Baldwin's aid had demonstrated the highest ideals of their order: courage, discipline, and absolute commitment to the defense of the Holy Land. In the years following the battle, the Templars continued to expand their network of castles and commanderies throughout the Crusader states. They invested heavily in fortifications, recognizing that control of key strategic points was essential to the defense of a kingdom that could never match its enemies in manpower. Politically, the Templars' influence grew both in the Holy Land and in Europe. Their demonstrated effectiveness at Montgisard enhanced their reputation as the shield of Christendom, leading to increased donations and bequests from the faithful. Their financial operations expanded correspondingly, making them not just a military force but an economic power that could influence kings and popes. Yet within this success lay the seeds of future problems. As the Templars grew in wealth and influence, they also attracted envy and suspicion. Their privileged position, answering only to the Pope, exempt from many taxes and obligations, created resentment among secular authorities. Their secretive practices and exclusive hierarchy fed rumors about what truly occurred behind the closed doors of their commanderies. When Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187, the Templars suffered a severe blow to their prestige. Despite fighting valiantly at Hattin, where most of their number present were killed or captured, they faced questions about why they had failed to save the holy city as they had done at Montgisard. The fact that the circumstances were entirely different, a divided kingdom under weak leadership facing a much more disciplined Ayyubid army, did little to stem the criticism. The Templars would continue to fight in the Holy Land for another century, adapting to the loss of Jerusalem by relocating their headquarters first to Acre and later to Cyprus. They would participate in all the major campaigns of the later Crusades, often serving as the professional corps around which larger Christian armies were organized. Yet they would never again achieve a victory as dramatic as Montgisard. The gradual loss of the Crusader territories culminated in the fall of Acre in 1291, forcing the Templars to withdraw entirely from the Holy Land. Without their original mission to justify their privileged position, they became increasingly vulnerable to their enemies. The final chapter in the Templar story came in 1307, when King Philip IV of France, heavily indebted to the order and coveting their wealth, arranged for the simultaneous arrest of Templars throughout his kingdom on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and various moral offenses. Under torture, many confessed to these improbable crimes, leading to a protracted legal process that ultimately resulted in the suppression of the entire order by Pope Clement V in 1312. The last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris in 1314, reportedly cursing King Philip and Pope Clement and prophesying that they would join him before God's judgment within the year. Coincidentally or not, both men died within the predicted time frame. So ended the order whose courage and discipline had helped save Jerusalem at Montgisard. Yet their legacy lived on in memory and myth, eventually giving rise to numerous theories, legends, and speculations that continue to captivate the popular imagination to this day. Any account of the Battle of Montgisard would be incomplete without a deeper exploration of its most remarkable figure, King Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Jerusalem. His story transcends the specific events of the battle to become one of history's most compelling narratives of courage in the face of adversity. Baldwin was born in 1161 to King Amalric I and Agnes of Courtenay. As the only son, he was heir to the Kingdom of Jerusalem from birth, a heavy responsibility in the most embattled of the Crusader states. His early childhood gave no indication of the challenges he would face. By all accounts, he was a healthy, intelligent boy who showed promise as a future ruler. The first signs of trouble appeared when Baldwin was about 9 years old. His tutor, William of Tyre, who would later become one of the most important chroniclers of the Crusader kingdoms, noticed that the young prince seemed unable to feel pain in one of his arms. According to William's account, he had observed Baldwin playing with his friends, allowing them to pinch and scratch his arm without reaction. Recognizing the ominous implications of this symptom, William reported his observations to the king. The diagnosis that followed confirmed their worst fears. Baldwin was suffering from leprosy, a disease that was both incurable and deeply stigmatized in medieval society. In most cases, such a diagnosis would have ended any possibility of a public role. Lepers were typically isolated from society, forced to wear distinctive clothing and carry bells to warn others of their approach. They were considered legally dead in many jurisdictions, unable to inherit property or exercise authority. But Baldwin was no ordinary child, and Jerusalem was no ordinary kingdom. The strategic importance of the Crusader states and the complex politics of succession meant that there was no question of setting aside the young heir. Instead, Baldwin continued his education and preparation for kingship, even as the disease progressed. When Amalric died unexpectedly in 1174, 13-year-old Baldwin became king, with Raymond III of Tripoli serving as regent during his minority. Despite his increasing physical limitations, Baldwin proved to be a quick study in the arts of governance and warfare. By the age of 15, he had assumed direct control of the kingdom, demonstrating a maturity and judgment beyond his years. The challenges he faced were immense. His kingdom was surrounded by hostile territories, many recently united under Saladin's leadership. Internally, factions competed for influence, often putting their own interests ahead of the kingdom's security. Baldwin's obvious physical decline, the progressive disfigurement and disability caused by leprosy, might have undermined his authority, but his courage and determination commanded respect even from those who plotted to succeed him. By the time of the Battle of Montgisard in 1177, Baldwin's condition had deteriorated significantly. He had lost sensation in much of his body, his facial features were increasingly affected, and he likely had limited use of his hands. Yet, when the moment of crisis came, he did not hesitate to take personal command of his forces, inspiring by example when mere words might have failed. The image of Baldwin IV at Montgisard, strapped to his horse, leading the charge against Saladin's vastly larger army, has resonated through the centuries precisely because it represents the triumph of will over circumstance. In an age that often viewed disease as divine punishment, Baldwin's victory seemed to vindicate him personally as well as his kingdom. The years following Montgisard saw Baldwin struggle increasingly with his health while working to secure his kingdom's future. Recognizing that he would not live to old age and could not father heirs, he carefully arranged the succession, first through his sister Sibylla and later through her son, Baldwin V. As his condition worsened, Baldwin foreshowed the same courage in facing death that he had shown in battle. He gradually delegated more authority while ensuring that experienced advisors remained in place to guide his successors. When he could no longer ride or walk, he had himself carried in a litter to maintain a public presence and demonstrate his continued commitment to his responsibilities. Baldwin IV died in 1185 at the age of 24, having reigned for 11 remarkable years. His death removed the kingdom's most capable leader at a critical moment, contributing to the poor decisions that would lead to disaster at Hattin 2 years later. the historical Baldwin IV stands in sharp contrast to many of his contemporaries. In an age of often brutal self-interest, he consistently placed his kingdom's needs above his personal comfort. In a society that viewed physical perfection as a sign of divine favor, he demonstrated that true strength comes from character rather than bodily health. And in a religious environment that often interpreted suffering as punishment, he maintained a faith that expressed itself through service rather than self-pity. Modern medical historians believe that Baldwin suffered from lepromatous leprosy, the most severe form of the disease. Without antibiotics, which would not be discovered for centuries, his condition was inevitably terminal. That he accomplished so much in his short life, including the crucial victory at Montgisard, makes his reign one of history's most remarkable examples of triumph over adversity. For the modern traveler or historian interested in the Battle of Montgisard, locating the exact battlefield presents challenges. Unlike some other famous battle sites that have been preserved or memorialized, Montgisard has largely been absorbed into the modern landscape of Israel. The battle is generally believed to have taken place near the ancient settlement of Gezer, close to the modern Israeli town of Ramlah, approximately 20 miles southeast of Tel Aviv. The area is now mostly agricultural land and suburban development, with little to indicate its historical significance. Archaeological investigation of the battlefield has been limited, though some artifacts have been recovered over the years during construction and farming activities. These include arrowheads, fragments of mail armor, and other military equipment consistent with 12th century warfare. For those determined to visit the approximate location, the Tel Gezer archaeological site offers the closest connection to the medieval landscape. This ancient Tel settlement mound would have been a visible landmark during the battle, though it was not directly involved in the fighting. The surrounding terrain, gently rolling hills transitioning from the coastal plain to the Judean foothills, gives some sense of the topography that Baldwin and Saladin would have navigated. In Ramla itself, visitors can explore remains from the medieval period, including the White Tower, a Crusader-era observation tower, the Pool of Arches, an underground Umayyad-era cistern, and the Crusader-era church of St. John the Baptist, which has since been converted into a mosque. While none of these structures is directly connected to the Battle of Montgisard, they provide context for understanding the material culture and architecture of the period. Jerusalem, about 30 miles to the east, offers more substantial connections to the Crusader era. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which the Crusaders renovated and expanded, remains one of Christianity's holiest sites. The Tower of David Museum, housed in what was once a Crusader fortress, includes exhibits on Jerusalem during the Crusader period. Perhaps the most direct connection to the participants in the battle can be found in the archaeological remains of Templar headquarters on the Temple Mount, though access to these areas is restricted due to the religious sensitivity of the site. The nearby Western Wall Tunnels tour reveals some elements of Crusader-era construction in the vicinity of the Temple Mount. For those interested in Saladin's perspective, the citadel in Cairo, Egypt, contains elements dating to the Ayyubid period, including fortifications built under Saladin's direction after his return from the Montgisard campaign. Damascus, Syria, where Saladin ruled before his invasion of the Crusader states, also contains numerous sites associated with the Sultan, including his tomb adjacent to the Umayyad Mosque. While physical reminders of the Battle of Montgisard may be limited, its memory lives on in historical accounts, artistic representations, and the ongoing scholarly and popular interest in the Crusader era. Modern military historians continue to analyze the battle as a case study in how determination, discipline, and effective leadership can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The Battle of Montgisard quickly entered the historical chronicles of both Christian and Muslim writers, though with notably different emphases. For Christian chroniclers like William of Tyre, the victory was nothing short of miraculous, demonstrating God's special favor toward Baldwin IV despite his affliction. These accounts emphasized the dramatic disparity in numbers and the personal courage of the young king. Muslim accounts, while acknowledging the severity of Saladin's defeat, tended to focus on practical factors like the dispersal of his forces and the element of surprise. Some suggested that the defeat was a necessary lesson that ultimately strengthened Saladin as a leader, preparing him for his later successes. As centuries passed, the memory of Montgisard faded somewhat in popular consciousness, overshadowed by more decisive engagements like Hattin and the eventual fall of Jerusalem. The Romantic movement of the 19th century, with its fascination with medieval chivalry and the exotic East, led to a revival of interest in the Crusades generally, though Baldwin IV received less attention than figures like Richard the Lionheart or Saladin himself. This changed somewhat with the publication of works like Sir Walter Scott's The Talisman, 1825, which, while focused on the Third Crusade, helped renew interest in the earlier period as well. Later works like Zofia Kosciuszka's The Leper King, 1937, dealt more directly with Baldwin IV's story, including his triumph at Montgisard. In recent decades, Baldwin IV and the Battle of Montgisard have enjoyed increased attention in popular culture. The 2005 film Kingdom of Heaven, directed by Ridley Scott, included a sympathetic portrayal of Baldwin, played by Edward Norton, though the battle itself was not depicted. Various historical novels, including Helena P. Schrader's Defender of Jerusalem, 2015, have explored Baldwin's reign in greater detail, often highlighting Montgisard as his defining achievement. The battle has also found its way into other media. It features in strategy games like Medieval II, Total War, and Crusader Kings, allowing players to recreate or alter the historical encounter. Documentaries exploring the history of the Crusades or the Templars frequently include segments on Montgisard as an example of Christian military success in an era that saw many defeats. For the Knights Templar in particular, Montgisard has taken on special significance in the mythology that has developed around the order since its suppression. Various Neo-Templar organizations, Masonic lodges, and esoteric groups have incorporated the battle into their traditions as an example of Templar valor and divine favor. The historical record of Montgisard, while impressive enough, has sometimes been embellished in these later retellings. Some accounts claim that the Templars were literally the only force on the battlefield besides the king himself, or that divine manifestations such as the appearance of St. George or celestial light guided the Christian forces. These elaborations reflect the battle's transition from historical event to cultural touchstone, a process common to many significant moments in military history. In modern Israel, where the battle took place, Montgisard receives relatively little attention compared to more recent historical events. However, academic interest in the Crusader period remains strong, with ongoing archaeological work helping to clarify the historical reality behind the medieval accounts. For military historians, Montgisard continues to be studied as an example of how leadership, morale, and tactical discipline can overcome numerical disadvantage. It is often compared to other famous against-the-odds victories throughout history, from Marathon in ancient Greece to Agincourt in the Hundred Years' War. To fully appreciate what transpired at Montgisard, it's worth examining the military tactics employed by both sides in greater detail. The 12th century represented a particular moment in the evolution of warfare, with heavy cavalry as the dominant offensive arm but increasingly sophisticated approaches to combined arms tactics. The core of Baldwin's force at Montgisard consisted of heavy cavalry, the knights of his royal household, noble vassals, and the Templar contingent. These warriors represented the elite of medieval military society, each the product of years of training and equipped at enormous expense. A fully equipped knight wore a mail hauberk shirt, extending from neck to knees, often with mail leggings, a conical helmet with nasal guard, or, increasingly by this period, a more enclosed helmet design. Under the mail, he would wear padded garments to absorb the impact of blows. His primary weapons included a lance for the initial charge, a sword for close combat, and possibly a mace or warhammer for dealing with heavily armored opponents. Most importantly, the knight was mounted on a specially bred warhorse, a destrier, trained to carry the weight of an armored man and to remain steady in the chaos of battle. These horses represented a major investment. A good destrier could cost more than the annual income of a substantial farm. The Templars represented the apex of heavy cavalry development. Unlike secular knights, who might train between hunts and social obligations, the Templars devoted themselves entirely to preparation for war. Their monastic discipline extended to military training, with regular drills and exercises maintaining their readiness. They fought as cohesive units rather than as individuals seeking personal glory, a significant advantage in the often chaotic melees of medieval battle. Baldwin's force also included infantry, primarily spearmen and archers. These would have been a mix of native-born Franks, descendants of the original Crusaders, local Christians of various Eastern denominations, and perhaps some Muslim auxiliaries. While less prestigious than the knights, these foot soldiers played a crucial role in medieval warfare, protecting the flanks of the cavalry, securing captured positions, and dealing with enemy infantry. Saladin's army presented a different tactical system. The elite of his force consisted of his Mamluk heavy cavalry, slave soldiers, primarily of Turkic origin, who were purchased as children, converted to Islam, and trained intensively as mounted warriors. Armed with composite bows, lances, and swords, they could function both as shock troops in close combat and as mobile archers, switching between roles as the situation demanded. Supporting the Mamluks were lighter cavalry units, including Bedouin auxiliaries and mounted archers from various parts of Saladin's domains. These provided screening, scouting, and harassment capabilities but lacked the defensive armor for sustained close combat. Saladin's infantry included both archers and spearmen, drawn from urban militia units, peasant levies, and professional soldiers. Unlike European armies, where infantry were often seen as merely supportive of the knights, Islamic armies of this period employed a more balanced approach, with foot soldiers playing central roles in their tactical systems. At Montgisard, the decisive factor was not the composition of the forces but how they were employed. Baldwin and his commanders recognized that their only chance lay in a concentrated attack aimed directly at Saladin's position. Rather than spreading their limited forces thin to engage the entire Muslim army, they formed what modern military analysts would call a Schwerpunkt, a point of maximum effort designed to break through enemy lines and create chaos. The initial Christian charge achieved complete surprise. Saladin's forces, dispersed and unprepared, had no time to form a proper defensive line. The psychological impact of hundreds of armored knights appearing suddenly and thundering toward them at full gallop cannot be overstated. Even veteran soldiers might break in such circumstances, and many of Saladin's troops were either inexperienced or had been lulled into complacency by the apparent absence of resistance to their advance. The Templar contingent, leading the charge alongside the king's household knights, exemplified the heaviest shock troops of the medieval battlefield. Their disciplined advance, maintaining formation even at a gallop, presented a unified front that smashed through the hastily assembled Muslim defenses like a battering ram. Once the initial breakthrough was achieved, the battle transformed into a series of chaotic melees. Here again, the Templars' discipline proved crucial. While secular knights might be tempted to pursue fleeing enemies individually, seeking glory or captives to ransom, the Templars maintained their cohesion, driving relentlessly towards Saladin's position. The targeting of Saladin himself represented a sophisticated understanding of the importance of command and control in medieval warfare. By forcing the Sultan to flee, Baldwin's forces effectively decapitated the Muslim army, leaving its component parts without central direction. What began as a tactical victory quickly cascaded into a strategic rout as communication and cohesion collapsed throughout Saladin's forces. For military historians, Montgisard demonstrates timeless principles of warfare: the importance of concentration of force, the value of surprise, the critical role of leadership, and the psychological dimension of combat. These principles would remain relevant long after the specific technologies and tactics of medieval warfare had been superseded. Beyond its immediate historical significance, the Battle of Montgisard offers several enduring lessons that transcend its medieval context. These insights into leadership, strategy, and human nature help explain why this encounter continues to fascinate historians and general readers alike. First, Montgisard demonstrates the impact of inspirational leadership in crisis. King Baldwin IV had every reason to avoid personal danger. His disease made physical combat extraordinarily difficult, and his death in battle would have left the kingdom in chaos. Yet, by literally strapping himself to his horse and leading from the front, he transformed a desperate gamble into a rallying point for his outmanned forces. His example reminds us that true leadership often means sharing risks rather than merely directing others to take them. Second, the battle illustrates how discipline can overcome numerical disadvantage. The Templars, with their monastic training and absolute commitment to their cause, represented a level of military professionalism rare in the medieval world. Their ability to maintain formation and focus on strategic objectives rather than individual glory provided the cutting edge that penetrated Saladin's defenses. In modern terms, we might see this as a validation of the principle that quality can triumph over quantity when properly applied. Third, Montgisard shows the danger of overconfidence and the value of proper preparation. Saladin, despite his general excellence as a commander, allowed his forces to become dispersed and vulnerable. His failure to maintain adequate scouting and his assumption that the Christians would remain passive behind their walls created the opportunity for Baldwin's surprise attack. Even the most brilliant leader can be undone by complacency. Fourth, the battle reminds us of the role of timing in military affairs. Baldwin struck at precisely the moment when Saladin was most vulnerable, after his forces had spread out to raid but before they could be recalled and reorganized. A day earlier, the Muslims would have been too concentrated to break. A day later, they might have already reunited after their raids. Success in warfare often depends on recognizing and seizing such fleeting opportunities. Fifth, Montgisard demonstrates the psychological dimension of combat. The shock of the Christian attack, the targeting of Saladin's command group, and the rapid collapse of morale following the Sultan's flight all underscore that battles are won not merely by killing enemies, but by breaking their will to fight. This principle would later be articulated by theorists like Karl von Clausewitz, but was clearly understood by medieval commanders like Baldwin. Finally, the battle and its aftermath offer insights into resilience and learning from failure. Saladin's response to his defeat, accepting responsibility, analyzing what went wrong, and methodically addressing the identified weaknesses, exemplifies how effective leaders grow from setbacks. His eventual victory at Hattin, using lessons learned from Montgisard, demonstrates that failure can be a powerful teacher for those willing to learn from it. These lessons help explain why Montgisard continues to be studied by military professionals and historians. While the specific weapons, armor, and tactics of medieval warfare are no longer relevant to modern combat, the underlying principles of leadership, strategy, and human psychology remain as applicable today as they were in 1177. As we conclude our exploration of the Battle of Montgisard, we return to the scene with which we began. 300 Templar knights thundering across the field toward Saladin's forces, their white mantles with red crosses billowing behind them, the leprous but indomitable King Baldwin IV at their head. It is an image that has resonated through the centuries, symbolic of courage against overwhelming odds. The battle itself lasted only a few hours on a November day in 1177, but its consequences would echo for years. It extended the life of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, enhanced the prestige of the Templars, and forced Saladin to reconsider his approach to conquering the Crusader states. That he would eventually succeed does not diminish the significance of what Baldwin and the Templars accomplished at Montgisard. For the modern audience, the battle offers a window into a world both utterly foreign and surprisingly familiar. The specific context, leprosy, crusading knights, religious warfare, belongs firmly to the medieval period. Yet the human elements, courage, leadership, strategic thinking, the desire to protect one's home and faith, transcend time and speak to enduring aspects of the human experience. Perhaps this is why Montgisard continues to captivate us. In the story of a teenage king with a terminal illness finding the courage to lead his outnumbered forces against a mighty enemy, we see an embodiment of the human capacity to rise above circumstance. In the disciplined devotion of the Templars, willing to ride toward almost certain death in fulfillment of their vows, we glimpse the power of conviction to transform ordinary men into extraordinary warriors. And in Saladin's ability to learn from defeat and eventually achieve his goals, we find a reminder that history's path is rarely straight and its final verdicts often long delayed. As we close this chapter of history, the dust of Montgisard settles once more over the plains of the Holy Land. The knights return to their castles, the king to his palace in Jerusalem, and Saladin to Egypt to contemplate what went wrong and how he might succeed next time. But the echo of hooves, the clash of steel, and the shouts of men fighting for causes greater than themselves continue to reach us across the centuries, reminding us of a moment when 300 Templar knights helped change the course of the Crusades. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. If you've enjoyed this exploration of the Battle of Montgisard, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales from history's forgotten corners. Until next time, may the past continue to illuminate our understanding of both the world and ourselves.